you, Josh. My name is Monterey Gardiner. I'm only a few months at ZeroAvia, but I would have to say it's absolutely a community. So, Dave Moreau.
Yeah, and I would say you have a long history in the space, so I mean, you're talking for ZeroAvia.
Yeah, speaking for ZeroAvia, I've been 20 years with hydrogen. That picture that we saw previously, I think that was ZeroAvia. And then Tyson Eckerly, I've worked with them. Annalisa Bevan, I was an intern at CARB delivering EV1s. I don't know if anybody has heard of Who Killed the Electric Car? Any hands? A couple in the back. So yeah, I've been at the Fuel Cell Partnership with Hyundai supporting the buses at AC Transit, 7 years with Department of Energy, 7 years with BMW, and now a handful of years working in aviation and trucking. So really happy to speak here. I only have a handful of slides, but I did want to say that this is ZeroAvia. It's really part of the community. So Dave Maroney from the Hollister City office is here. Sean Herrera is also part of the local government and community. Christina Chavez, part of the San Benito County Development. We also have our technician, Dima, is here. He brought our fuel cell car. If anybody hasn't been or around, there's 10,000 cars in California, but we have a nice picture opportunity with the car out there. And my dad's here in the back, and my brother. So I grew up off-grid in Sonoma, so I've been passionate about energy throughout my career.
Monterey, we have Renee here with us.
Oh yes, and Renee, thank you. Yeah, she came out to visit and talk about microgrids.
Great, well, we're really glad to have such a strong showing from San Benito and Hollister. You know, a big part of what we do, especially in partnership with MBEP, is you know, try to strengthen these connections between the counties, and so appreciate you guys making the trip out here.
Thank you for hosting it. It's a good opportunity. So I only have a handful of slides. My focus is on infrastructure, so I'm a hydrogen program manager, but we're working with external parties. We talked to Zoe Lofgren. She's our local representative, and she's ready to help. You can see from the previous presentation, I think California has pushed so hard for so long to get to this point, and it's now right at this point where I think we're getting to that tipping point where there's economic pull. This has always been the question, how do you get hydrogen to work? But for ZeroAvia, I'm gonna go wrong way. There we go.
There you go.
All right, so this is from most of the slides from our website, but this is what we're working towards. It's fuel cells in aviation. Right, we want a fuel cell powertrain with hydrogen, supplying that to be in, oops, did I just go forward? No, okay. In all aircraft, right, that's our mission statement. So we're focused in this 2025 timeframe. We had some early test flights in the UK. There's a close relationship with FAA here in the US and in the UK. So we're doing some of the experimental testing there. We're looking to moving to liquid in 2027 for the next larger size and continuing. So this is what ZeroAvia's focus is providing drivetrains, coming from my previous background, but for the powertrain for this zero emission airplanes or aircraft. So why are we doing this? We've heard about how important it is for decarbonization. The aviation sector is really tough to decarbonize. You can see jet fuel gallons on the left, and CO2 emissions. And if we're gonna have a path to net zero, there's really tough decarbonization path here. And depending on time at the end, I'll talk a little bit about carbon-less versus decarbonization, and what are the decisions and choices you make in the next few years that might lead you to different endpoints in the 2050 timeframe. But this is why we're focused on zero
Just a
emission.
question, just because we have, you know, Joby right over here and all this focus on eVTOL.
Yeah.
What's the relationship between hydrogen and electric? What's the...
So if you want to go more than 10, 15, 30 miles, you might want to move to hydrogen. So it's the weight of the batteries. And I think Joby is working towards that shortly, if not already, to figure out that transition. So if you can, maybe there are other opportunities like Beta. They did some flights from New Hampshire to Arkansas with a VTOL with a fixed wing. So there are some options, but if you have to go fast and far, then you will probably need to go to hydrogen. And if you do go to hydrogen, it'll need to be liquid because of the energy density. So a lot of the companies are starting with gaseous because it's easier, but liquid hydrogen is kind of the end goal, and you mentioned there was a press release earlier this month
That
with
was a
H2
liquid
Fly.
hydrogen. Okay.
Yeah, in Stuttgart, I think.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's coming. But I'm speaking from ZeroAvia's infrastructure vision, and I apologize, these aren't labeled, but it all starts for us at renewable energy. So whether it's wind or solar, moving to electrolysis, and I think it's really important to have that opportunity to shift energy, right, in time and place. That's what hydrogen does. So you build out the number of batteries, right? We have 3 gigawatts here in Moss Landing of battery power, but at some point it becomes too costly as you have to get beyond, right, a few days to a week where hydrogen makes sense for your energy storage. And this is the first step in that process. So you have 2 pathways once you have your electrolysis done, and you've done as much batteries as you can afford. And you can either have a compressed gas pathway, so that's relatively low energy, and if you don't have to transport it more than 100 miles, that might make sense. So you have a compressor, some bulk storage, and a mobile refueler. And so for the smaller aircraft, shorter distance, the compressed gas might be fine. But kind of my focus, my expertise, and I think is the end goal for most transportation, if you're serious about making money, serious about decarbonization, is getting to cryogenic liquid hydrogen. I think Larry could talk about that a little bit later during the networking. So you have a liquefier, you have bulk storage, and then you have a mobile refueler, and that brings out to the aircraft. Any questions about this, even though it's not labeled and I've been talking fast, but I'll break here.
Yeah, so
Ed.
in terms of actually putting the hydrogen on board the aircraft, does it unload the tanks from the truck, or does it actually fuel the tanks that are already in the airplane?
So that's our competitor. So United Hydrogen, they just had to ferry their plane down from Washington to Mojave with a few stops, but they're looking at swapping out the tanks, so like a AA battery. And I think that's great up to the first 10, 15, 20 demonstrations, but at some point the real challenge is in that 24-hour periods, whether it's a trucking facility, a port, or an airport, you're gonna be moving tanks over that boundary line instead of molecules. And so at some point when you're serious about that end goal, you need to transition to just the molecules. I'm not sure if that's the question.
Yeah.
Any other? Yeah.
What about the compression? Because that would take a ton of energy too, right? To get it to a liquid.
Yeah, so kind of where we start, and I'll throw a whole bunch of numbers, but trying to think if I can make it a little bit simpler here. So when you look at the energy stored in the hydrogen, you're gonna lose about half of that just through the fuel cell. So in that energy in the hydrogen, it's probably about 10% or a little less is the compression energy. So 10% of the energy in the hydrogen goes to compression. If you're gonna liquefy it, it might be upwards of 30%. And the question is, are you gonna use that energy in transporting the molecules to where it's used, or are you gonna use it? So cryogenics is energy storage. So compression takes energy, but if you have a lot of wind and solar, and somebody here can talk about, maybe Ed, about peaks in the daytime and what PG&E is doing. Anybody heard of net metering 3.0? Mm-hmm. So right now it went from like 5 to 10 years or less to much longer because the grid can no longer serve as a storage, free storage for your electrons from your solar. So what do you do with that? At that point, efficiency is less important if you're serious about a carbonless grid versus incremental decarbonization. Too much, or? Okay, any other questions?
When do you see liquefaction being a viable solution from a cost standpoint, given the fact that, Plug Power's evolution of last year has gone from $15 million for a 15-ton minimum now to $45 million for a 15-ton minimum? I mean, it looks like they're kind of just taking advantage of the market because there are issues, but you see that cost effectiveness being approached anytime near term where that liquefied hydrogen can be redeployed to compete with SAF, for example.
What would be the target date to go to work?
So I think we're there now, right? We have upwards of 250 tons, and that was a tripling in 2018. I think Bloomberg has looked at 1,000 tons by 2030, and half of that is Plug Power. So I think the economies of scale, liquid hydrogen is inevitable. It's coming. Bringing it down in cost, you're right. We have to figure out that deployment. And as you drop down in scale, whether you're at 50 tons a day or 15 tons a day, right, even though you've dropped down, right, 50, 80% or whatever, the cost is only gonna drop 10%. It's hard to do liquefaction at small scale, but that's my dream, is if you can, working with Larry and UC Santa Cruz, if we could figure out that small 1 to 4 ton a day, even though it's a high capital cost, if you could pair that electrolyzer with low cost components, with renewables that are running at, right, 20 to 30, 40% capacity factor, I think that's the holy grail, is figuring out small scale liquefaction that's lower cost.
The LCO waste center is really the biggest factor right now versus the cryogenic.
Yeah, the levelized cost of hydrogen
Right.
versus, which is part of the energy coming in.
The upstream side versus the downstream side of going cryogenic with it, right? It sounds like the cost of hydrogen, the need for, renewables to support the electrolysis and that being the one, or the biggest, piece of the pie, so to speak, of the current cost scenario. Is that what I'm understanding, or?
So,
Hydrogen is a bigger part of the cost than the actual liquefaction is that?
oh, okay, so you're talking about the capital cost versus energy. I'm getting lost. I think we need primary energy at 2 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour for hydrogen to make sense, and you need to run down that curve in order for liquefaction and for it to be widespread market pull.
Got it, thanks. Appreciate
Is
it.
that, we can talk in the break.
Yeah, thanks,
Okay.
appreciate it.
So, and that's really tough when you're looking at biomass, where it can be relatively low cost to some of these others. However, right, you still have to deal with land use and other carbon issues. So it's a
Right.
question of, are you reaching towards a carbonless grid in 2050, or right, 80% decarbonization? And you're gonna make different investment decisions in the next 5 years depending on what your end goal is.
Right, thanks.
Next slide. All right. Oh, wrong direction. I'm gonna shut things down if I'm not careful. So for ZeroAvia, right, we're really focused on, right, the electrolyzer, right, that carbonless hydrogen production, figuring out that renewable energy connection, and then the systems development, liquefaction, storage, and getting it on the aircraft. And so that's what ZeroAvia is really focused, my particular business division. We also have one that's looking at high temperature fuel cells that allows you to reject heat much more easily. There's another company called Advent that Hyundai is working with out of Los Alamos, but it's not just us. Some have said that high temperature fuel cells have failed running at 200 degrees C instead of 80, but that doubling in temperature makes it a lot easier to reject heat, which makes your heat exchangers much smaller, your radiator. So that's important for our development, is that integration between the liquid hydrogen and the high temperature fuel cell to get the weight and cost down. Any questions on here? So I think we've talked about this. So hardware, so Ed is here. He's helped us with some of the solar install and design. We have a 10 kilowatt trailer. We're looking at that green hydrogen production. So this is just kind of very, very low scale, figuring out how do we island our house, warehouse there in Hollister that's adjacent to the airport, so that we have a mega battery that's here. And then we're looking at upscaling from this 10 kilowatt electrolyzer to 300 kilowatts. We've been working very closely with the fire department. We're not building a fueling station. We're just venting the hydrogen to show that we can control it. But we're grateful to California. They just released a law October of last year that says you can get an administrative permit. You don't have to go through a full county hall, city hall review. You work with a fire marshal and you say, we're making a fueling station. And it's a much, much streamlined process. So grateful to California for putting that in place. And once we go on beyond just testing the electrolyzer, figuring out what the microgrid might look like, that's the next step. But really grateful to the Hollister City community in helping us stand up this. I think innovation is really important, and getting to this point, right, how do we reach towards a carbonless grid, carbonless energy. Carbon neutral is gonna be tough by 2045, but I think that's, I don't know if it's an order, or if it's turned into a law yet, but starting with Brown and Newsom and being more aggressive, right? This is coming.
We've got some ambitious goals.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it's great to hear about the city partnership there too, because at the very local level, you have to have that buy-in and support to move towards, something that doesn't yet exist, right? That we want to test and develop. And so I think that's a great story, actually, from the city level. I think, Marina should, like to hear about that and be another good case study and how we can work with industry to kind of, find the best, least cost path to supporting the innovation.
Absolutely.
Making
In our
a
first,
mental note right now, City of Hollister, okay?
So talking to David and the mayor there, the biggest challenge for economic growth there was the incredible cost for PG&E to build out the substation. So our neighbor had put in a giant warehouse, and they had subscribed all the power, and I'm still trying to figure out if these are really the right numbers, but upwards of $500 million to get the high voltage transmission and that substation for further growth. So whether it's microgrids, more renewables, at that top of that pyramid that came back from the question from Bill, who's up next, is what's that primary energy cost, and how do we reduce permitting costs? How do we facilitate as much solar and wind as possible to make this cost competitive sooner than later?
Yeah, just a question on that. I mean, so this PG&E issue is not isolated to Hollister. It was something that we were dealing with here, and I think if we're looking at wide scale adoption of electric or hydrogen, there's got to be that's going to be a challenge, at local airports and throughout the state. Do you know yet, or I guess maybe that's what you're looking at, is what's the cost benefit between extending a PG&E grid or establishing these microgrids, whether it's the solar or whatever locally that's provided?
So funny you should ask. If you can talk to Sean and Christina, we were just thinking about this, right? What is the baseline cost? So we have the community choice aggregation, which sits in between PG&E and the local level, and rather than those profits going into PG&E and that investor-owned utility, they come back into the grid. What's the cost in working with them to see how do we make a more robust grid? And then the holy grail, depending on your points of view and total cost, is something like a municipal utility. So Sacramento, Los Angeles, those are some of the more famous or well-known large municipal utilities. But if you're going to spend that much money, right, you're going to start with the microgrids, which is prioritizing loads, but you have to figure out what's that baseline cost. Is it really $500 million or something less? How do you structure bonds? How do you work with your Congress representatives? There's a lot of people that want to help with this energy transition. It's just figuring out what that baseline is.
Strategic opportunity for the region to push on that one, especially with the work you guys are already doing out there.
So I don't want to hold up Bill, but are there any other questions, or I'll stick around, we can take pictures. Oh, yes.
Have you looked at other feedstocks like hydro or geothermal, or what else is out there?
Not so much. I mean, kind of the short answer is between hydro and geothermal, they're closer to base load, and so they can go straight into the grid. The value of the electrolyzer is taking those intermittent renewables with large-scale storage, putting it in, similar with biomass. With hydro, it's maybe not well known, but year to year you can get 20% changes in output because of drought and other seasonal issues. So if you're building a 20-year business on a capital life piece of equipment and you're having that change in your primary feedstock, it might be harder to prepare for it. That being said, having grown up in Sonoma without electricity, I think at the very small local scale, it has some merit. But if you're changing, transforming society, those electrons would be better suited directly into the grid.
But just on the biomass point, you've mentioned this a couple of times. So that could be agricultural.
So SAF, like airplanes are really hard to decarbonize. It's going to be out towards the latter half of the 2030s before we get that. So for SAF, if you're looking at some of the other items that are really hard to decarbonize, where hydrogen is taking longer than expected, I think that's kind of the low-hanging fruit after you've done energy efficiency and several others. But using or even offsetting renewables where you have that spinning reserves, that's a better place for biomass than hydrogen.
Okay.
So yeah, SMUD has some projects, County of Sacramento. looking at that specifically, waste turbines
Okay,
for gensets.
interesting.
So I've spoken too much, but I love talking about energy, so I'm happy to
It
speak
comes
more
through, it's very
offline.
fun.
Okay,